major atrocity crimes, pandemic, climate change, and worsening of human rights violations. Today, we have an amazing panel on COVID-19 and hate speech in South Asia to talk about the impacts and solutions to counter hate speech, false information against ethnic and religious minorities in South Asia during this pandemic. But before we get started, I just wanted to give you a formal idea on what to expect during the series. First, we'll take a few minutes to introduce our panelist. Then we will kick off with the conversation by asking the questions that are focused on this particular theme. And then in the second half, we'll open the floor to you guys to take the opportunity to ask questions to our panelists. I hope that sounds good, and I hope that you would be interested in doing so. And we want this interaction to be as interactive as possible. There are just few housekeeping matters that we want to keep in mind to ensure that all participants are able to hear our speakers. We request all participants, whether from your computer or mobile devices, to be on mute and your videos off at all time. We will reserve the final 15 to 20 minutes for the Q&A session. You can either type your questions at any point of time during the discussion, or you can use to raise your hand button in Zoom to ask questions during the Q&A session. And last, I would also like you to note that this session will be recorded and accordingly will be uploaded on the WFM or the Coalition's website. So, well, great. Well, that's out of the way. So let's get started. I would like to first introduce our first panelist, Ms. Pallavi Pundir. She is a Mumbai-based journalist and writer for Vice India and has been reporting from the region for the last 8 years. Ms. Pallavi has expertise in reporting on gender, civil injustice, tech, and surveillance culture. Her work explores the invisible and the underreported, while also focusing on the social and cultural consequences of events. And our second panelist is Ms. Usha Kula. She is the member of the Human Rights Committee Bar Council Malaysia and the chairperson of the Coalition for the International Criminal Court Malaysia. She has been working with the regional civil society organization and leading the Malaysian coalition to work towards Malaysia's ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Currently, Ms. Usha has been working with the Bar Council and other local civil society organizations in providing humanitarian aid during the pandemic to victims of armed conflict residing in Malaysia, mainly the Rohingyas, Syrians, Palestinians, and Yemen refugees. I thank you both for being a part of the COVID-19 dialogue series. So, as we all know, the pandemic has changed the world and has had devastating effects on health, work, economy, education, while millions continue to fight for survival. While we have seen solidarity between nations and community to address these challenges together, we have unfortunately also seen a global rise in hate speech and discrimination. We recently saw that there was like a 900% increase in hate speech seen on Twitter against China. South Asia too witnessed this hate speech during COVID-19, especially being targeted to the already marginalized group. Even though social media companies have struggled to contain hate speech in the region, policymakers, media, public continues to increasingly launch verbal attacks, which have been tweeted and retweeted. And in context to India, these attacks have further incited hate towards Muslims, with recently accusing them of spreading the virus deliberately. And additionally, last year, we saw that the policymakers excluded Muslims from the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens Act. So I would like to invite Ms. Pallavi to share her insights on how hate speech has impacted people's behavior in Asia, especially during the pandemic? And what role can civil society like WFM play in helping social media platforms to contain hate speech while still fight for freedom of expression?
Thanks, Naureen, and thanks everyone who's joined today. Like in terms of India, if I could just give a little bit of background, a lot of people, including me, especially, like the urban dwellers, we first realized, we woke up to the reality of fake news like way back in 2018. And this is when, like our data plans were becoming cheap and basically, all the rural pockets were getting really connected because everybody had smartphones. So yeah, this was when one rumor on WhatsApp led to a spate of lynchings in small town India, as in like small Indian towns. And this is at a time where connectivity was still a little limited, but WhatsApp was being used by a huge population because it became this functional communication device. Messaging was free, so that was great, and it wasn't just being used to talk to families and friends, but also like to conduct business, distribute news, and a lot of political parties started pumping in promotional material irrespective of whether they're true or false. But at this point, like today, India is one of the biggest market for social media platforms. It has over 300 million users and counting. And all of this has had a dark, ugly side in which, because even though we have the internet, we have like a lot of people on social media, we still have the problem of, like not having enough digital literacy. And a lot of people, that's why like a lot of people fall prey to manipulation and fake news. So in 2018, it escalated to a point where WhatsApp was mobilizing people to execute acts of violence against certain communities. These are the communities that, as you said, they were they're already marginalized. They are considered, like outsiders. So yeah, and today there are, apart from WhatsApp, there are more platforms. There's Twitter, there's Facebook, Instagram, etc. And fake news and misinformation has therefore revived age-old stigmas, xenophobia, and biases against certain communities. What we see today is a continuation of that. And of course, like things have definitely escalated. We have seen a lot of discrimination against Asian communities across the world, but in India, we're seeing it against the people from northeastern states who are facing a lot of racist comments and violence. And of course, like now, minority Muslim communities in India are being targeted, and following the news of the Tablighi Jamaat congregation, like leading to a bunch of positive cases, it has led to a lot of witch hunting of Muslims, and it's happening right now also. Like even today, I came across like a fact-checking website called Alt News. They had busted a fake news on, like basically a bunch of Muslims being. I don't know, like it was basically a fake news, but like, and it's not just like these minorities. We're also seeing how fake news and misinformation is affecting the disenfranchised and disadvantaged, including the migrants who are stuck in like Indian cities without any jobs, without any means of livelihood. They want to go home, but the borders are sealed because we are undergoing the world's harshest and strictest lockdown right now. So there have been instances where they've received fake news about a certain train restarting, and they have all gathered in like hundreds of numbers. And people, of course, like there has been a lot of, like fake news about how migrants are now violating lockdown on purpose. So we are seeing a lot of this fake news and misinformation hurting the marginalized communities, marginalized, disadvantaged, vulnerable communities. And it does have a huge human cost. Like it marginalizes marginalized communities even more, like in terms of access to healthcare, ration, like and other means of sustenance. And apart from driving, like the stigmas and discrimination and other negative stereotyping of people, like it's become an everyday reality right now. But what organizations like yours can do at this point is definitely we need more awareness. We need to create a framework and start a dialogue with players such as WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, people, and these organizations, they have their fact-checking team, and a lot is apparently being done, but it's just not enough. Like on Twitter, you need to, like have a certain number of reports so that they can take action. Facebook has, I think, a fact-checking team, but they just like, they don't have much reach. And I think like this is also the time where we have to engage with fact-checking initiatives in different countries, because they're the only ones who are doing the dirty work. They're going through the burden of, like busting fake news and misinformation on a daily basis and empower people. But even their reach is limited, because it only comes to people, like English speaking people like us. It reaches a very small community. So yeah, it's definitely it would be worthwhile to look at, like engaging with these fact checking initiatives in different countries and empower them in terms of helping them reach a large segment of smartphone users. And of course, like digital literacy is going to be a part of it, but it can't be like a one person job at this point.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pallavi. Certainly, it is very vital to not only spread awareness, but to engage with social media companies and institutes to burst out these fake news, because hate speech and fake news has had serious implications on society, as you also mentioned, mainly targeting the most vulnerable communities. I mean, last month, due to such misconceptions, we saw hundreds of Rohingya refugees stuck at sea for 2 months and were denied entry into Malaysia because there was a rumor that they were bringing COVID-19 to their shores. And the Malaysia officials had pushed back boats and turned these desperate Rohingya people away, stating that was a pandemic measure. Thailand too had indicated the same thing and had refused entry of the Rohingya boats into their region. But we also know that under international laws, especially in response to COVID-19, in response to the pandemic, it has been stated that public health must be proportionate. It should be non-discriminatory and should be based on available scientific evidence. And countries like Malaysia and Thailand and India, all of them have responsibility to provide access to women, children, families seeking asylum, especially during a crisis, especially when there are these sort of misconceptions that are a threat to life. Therefore, in this context, I would like to request Ms. Usha to take the floor and share with us the challenges that the refugees residing in Asia are currently facing, and what stakeholders need to be engaged to help develop and implement proper protocols to ensure that refugees remain in safety, and especially during the pandemic, the measures that needs to be taken. Ms. Usha, please.
Thank you, Naureen. Thank you for having me at this chat session. First and foremost, it is with a huge amount of regret, that I have to say that Malaysia had a very unfortunate experience of hearing and the xenophobia and the racist comments with regards to the Rohingya. On the boats, first and foremost, there were 2 boats. Yeah, there were 2 boats. First boat was in mid-April. It was at sea for about 2 months. In that time, the estimate is about 50 to 60 people actually died on water. The boat sailed out with about 500 people and about 50 to 60 died, which means that about 400 odd were finally led by Bangladesh into Busan Cha, which is the island. Again, that island is not habitable. And the issue at that stage itself in April was the rumor and fake news, hate speech, whichever way you want to turn it. The effect and the result is it led to the misconception that the people on the boat, possibly the allegation was that they had the COVID-19 and therefore they shouldn't come on shore. That was one aspect of the Malaysian government argument. The second aspect, of course, was that the excuse given was that because of the pandemic, they were not allowed to land because Malaysia already has its hands full with the people, dealing with COVID-19 here. So that was the first vote. Travesty of justice as it is, it was out there for 2 months. The second vote was earlier this month, and that vote actually had about 200 to 300 people, and again was refused entry to Malaysian shores. And finally, Bangladesh again allowed that boat to land in Busancha. Now, having said all that, those are the factual elements. I have to stress that the minute the WHO declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic, international humanitarian law immediately kicks in, and that is customary law. So the argument here that the Malaysian government is using is that they haven't ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention, they don't recognize refugees, they don't recognize asylum seekers. All that is by the by. The minute a pandemic has been announced, it means international humanitarian law immediately kicks in. International humanitarian law dictates that everyone is treated equally, Malaysian or migrants. Now, this is something that no government can run away, especially members of the United Nations, which Malaysia is. And also Malaysia signed up to the Geneva Conventions, which means they recognize international humanitarian law. So for them to have that vote out there for 2 months and to have 50 to 60 people, the numbers we have to check, but definitely a large sizable amount actually died. That is a travesty of justice in itself, and that is a breach of IHL, international humanitarian law. In addition to that, Malaysia has signed up to UNCLOS, which is the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea, which again has provisions for humanitarian aid to be given at times of absolute trial and tribulation, and in which case here when people actually needed it. And you had the Rohingyas out there at sea for two months. Yes, sure, they gave food and whatever, but at the end of the day, you had people dying. So this is something that until today, that there's been a huge public outcry. We had a petition signed by 84 NGOs, ourselves included, where we have raised a lot of the issues, and we are still waiting for answers from our own government. Having said that, I am really ashamed to say that a large section of the Malaysian population have come up with huge racist comments, xenophobic comments, and definitely fake news, alleging that it's the migrant workers, and especially the Rohingya people carrying COVID-19. There's absolutely no factual basis for that whatsoever. So this is a misconception that has been going around, and we had talking about hate speech, because the topic today is hate speech, fake news as well. We had a petition, and that garnered about 500,000 Malaysian signatures requesting for the Rohingya to be shipped back to where they came from. Let's just cut straight to the chase and say this. The reason that the Rohingya are leaving Myanmar is because, firstly, we know Myanmar doesn't even recognize them as citizens. They are, under the Rome Statute of the ICC, victims of armed conflict. There's no two ways about it. They have suffered and continue to suffer progressively, especially from the year 2017. They have been welcomed to Malaysia's shores in periodic periods. You know, you had boats, sometimes the boats were not allowed in, but eventually we have about 170,000 Rohingya migrants here, and we term them asylum seekers. And they're immediately given, from what I understand, a large sizable figure, given UNHCR cards because they are fleeing conflict. They are not coming here because they're looking for work. They're not economic migrants. They're asylum seekers, and they're fleeing genocide. And you know, the ICC has taken up this the point. We have a case right now at the ICC where the issue is of genocide. Of course, that's at investigation stage, and hopefully it progresses further. We also have another case at the ICJ, Gambia versus Myanmar, and that's still progressing. So there is no way for anyone to run away from the fact that they are victims of armed conflict, and all the more reason assistance must be rendered to such people who are fleeing war. You cannot repatriate them back to Myanmar because that would be subjecting them to genocide. So you see, the issue here is that hate speech, fake news can go very far and can actually lead to very disastrous and fatal results. So this is one point. The other point, of course, I must say, as far as international law is concerned, Malaysia has ratified the CRC and CEDAW. The CRC deals with the Convention for the Rights of the Child, and CEDAW deals with women. So when you had those boats out there, of course there were women and children, and once they come within a certain nautical mile of Malaysian shores, that is Malaysian shores, and those conventions immediately apply to the boat people, as we call them. So this is extremely prejudicial to the cause. We at the CICC have been working, with our NGO colleagues. We have been working with the Bar Council Human Rights Committee, together with the Bar Council Migrant Committee, and with a lot of other NGOs on the ground, together with the UNHCR, to come to terms with this whole situation, to help and assist as much as possible, together with our MPs as well. So actually, we've been doing that progressively over the last 3 months, and we continue to do that. We ensure that those who are here are received as much assistance as possible. But sadly to say, over the last 1 week, a large amount of migrants have been put in detention centers, primarily street detention centers, even though we raise a lot of concerns that if you put them in detention centers where there is no breathing space, of course, that might be an outbreak of COVID, and sure enough, there was. So we're having to deal with that situation right now. The issue of the Rohingya, as far as possible, I do understand the Malaysian government is still mulling about the status of the Rohingya. They are protected under international law. There's no two ways about it. We have made our views very clear. And also, we are working together with the UNHCR to ensure that protection is accorded to them at all times. So that is where it is at this moment. Yeah, Naureen, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Usha. I think it is important to have to work on this humanitarian aid and to have certain protocols to protect refugees because they definitely are a very vulnerable community and group to be seen. And as you rightly said that, hate speech and misconception does reach as far, and it can be threat to life. And such feelings and conversation, I think, are being advanced through digital and social media platforms. And companies of social media, they continue to face these challenges on containing the misconceptions and hate speech and harassment that is going. And I think that government and political leaders and officials have started to practice social media restrictions due to several reasons. I can actually cite an example. For example, in 2019, Sri Lanka on an Easter Sunday had experienced one of the most devastating terrorist attacks, where the suicide bomber killed about 350 people and injured 500 at church and at a high-end hotel. This attack led to the government to block all access to social media platforms, to curtail the spread of information and these tensions. While in Malaysia, I think, while there was no restrictions of social media as such, but because there was so much of misconception, Malaysia withdrew last year from ratifying the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Therefore, it did not become a state party of the court. Therefore, I would again like Ms. Usha to just tell us about what she would think about the measures that are taken by government that lead to a nationwide restriction of social media as a measure to curtail the spread of fake news. What do you think? Is it the right way to go, and how should these measures be taken in future? Or how can institute like the International Criminal Court of the UN body should take to tackle such misconceptions to avoid major consequences, especially during the pandemic when social media is such an essential aspect to access information and to also curb the fake news? So I would again give the floor to you just to give a brief on what you think on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. First and foremost, as far as Malaysia is concerned, we have we're governed primarily by the core federal constitution, and under Article 10 of our federal constitution, freedom of speech, is very much enshrined. And it should be. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression. It's very much enshrined in Article 10. Now, having said that, that doesn't give the right for fake news, because freedom of speech means you have the right to express your views on facts. Because if facts are contrived, if the facts are twisted, if facts become untruth, then it's fake news. And you cannot, in all earnestness, and this has been our huge argument with the Rohingya issue, with the public at large, and also with certain parts of the authority. The issue here is that if you're dealing with fake news, you cannot counter fake news, because at the essence, facts are the truth, and truth defends itself. So essentially, when you're dealing with fake news and it steamrolls, it has, like we said, fatal consequences, where people like the Rohingya have been dealt a severe blow in terms of the xenophobia, the racist comments, which we never saw prior to the pandemic. So this is one thing. Now, what are we going to do about it? Quite frankly, the measures that have been mooted are, one, if we know that a post has been put up and we know it's fake news, it is the responsibility, I think, of every citizen, regardless of whether or not they have a human rights background or whether or not they have human rights consciousness. Every citizen should immediately alert the authorities, and that post should be taken down, let's say within 24 hours. That is something that needs to be done. I do believe at this moment in time, we do have laws, and we do have certain measures. The anti-fake news bill was repealed because it didn't sit well with the previous government. That's off the shelf at the moment. So it very much depends on the public to govern themselves, which means that you have to consistently have educational sessions with the public in order to ensure that there is a counterbalance. There will always be fake news. There will always be racism. There will always be xenophobia. That has been from time immemorial. But in order to actually counter that, I think it is incumbent on all of us as civilized human beings to ensure that if we see a post that is up there and we know it's fake news or it's based on racism, we should immediately alert the authorities or the groups that we're in and have that taken down. Having said that, let me talk a little bit about the CICC. The CICC is a special project under the Human Rights Committee of the Malaysian Bar. So we set this up last year. Actually, it was already there, but in a very small way. But when Malaysia withdrew, we relaunched it in a very big way as well. And we brought in more lawyers, we brought in more NGOs, we brought in think tanks, we've asked for our MPs to come in with inputs. So it is a very growing grassroots level mandate that we have at this moment, so that we have a platform in which to educate the public, educate the lawyers. So it swings every single way. because again, about fake news, there was huge misconception about the rule statute of the ICC, and it was completely misinterpreted, misunderstood, and we're trying very hard right now to correct all that through the CICC Malaysia. And I'm very proud to say that we have a very good group of people within the Human Rights Committee of the Malaysian Bar, and we're continuing to work on that. And once the pandemic is, well, the pandemic is not going to be really over, but once the lockdown is actually lifted, we already have some sessions organized on the fake news element of things, the racism element, and the issue of victims of armed conflict, not only Rohingya, which primarily have been targets of huge xenophobic abuse, but also, of course, other victims of armed conflict that we have here, which are the Yemenis, Palestinians, the Syrians, all that require the same amount of protection under IHL, International Humanitarian Law. So this is where we need to hold our government accountable, because IHL is customary international law. They cannot escape that. They may not want to ratify certain treaties and so on, but you cannot escape IHL, International Humanitarian Law. That is tried, that is customary law. They are a member of the United Nations, and they need to fulfill their obligations. Thank you, Naureen.
Thank you so much, Ms. Usha. I think that's very interesting, and thank you also for giving a brief on the International Court, especially the participants who are very new to this topic, maybe. But I would also want to talk a bit more about social media and surveillance. And even though that it's a great tool to practice the freedom of speech, especially in the largest democracies in Asia, like India and Sri Lanka and Thailand, and knowing that the social media is mostly the biggest user is the young generation, is the young public that rely on social media outlets like WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram. When there's a restriction on such social media platforms or internet as a whole, we have witnessed devastating effects. And coming back to the context in India, last year we saw that the government had imposed the ban on internet in Kashmir after it was stripped of its autonomy, and there was a military lockdown that was put in. It was under military lockdown. And now, even though that the internet has been allowed, there's very little access to internet, where people in Kashmir are struggling to receive information about the pandemic, about essential services, about health services, or even to have any contact with their families or outside world. So I, on this context, would like to ask Ms. Pallavi on how do you think the media, the public, the institutes can stop or pressurize the government from taking such extreme measures, especially restricting the public to get information during this pandemic on health and essential services affecting them vastly. And how can we engage mainly the young generation or the young people in this conversation as they are being impacted the most with such restrictions?
So in India, we're seeing something really interesting and crazy at the same time. Like there is, under the pandemic, there is this escalation of surveillance, and like everything from monitoring, like quarantine people to like the contact tracing app that's been introduced, which has raised a lot of privacy issues. Like there is this heavy focus on the government's part to really impose surveillance on its people to apparently contain the spread of the virus. But at the same time, India is also, like we've seen like one of the maximum number of internet shutdowns in just the last 5 years. In fact, Kashmir, as you mentioned, it witnessed the longest internet shutdown. I think it was one of the longest internet shutdowns in the entire world. And Kashmir is the world's most militarized zone. So Kashmir actually poses a very interesting problem because the internet is a very vague space over there. You know, like over there, you could be arrested for putting an anti-government thought on your social media, and the government officials will come and pick you up because they'll call it cyberbullying. So, you know, like the normal laws of the internet are just, you know, like they're very vague and just not put together in Kashmir. So it is, yeah, so that's why it is very common to see all these internet shutdowns in Kashmir. A lot of people you know, like suffer because of that, and especially, as you said, during the pandemic, where they have absolutely no access to information about the virus. There's also the government crackdown against people who are seen as anti-state. So yeah, the government, there are like all these things happening, but we've also seen, you know, it's not just Kashmir. Whenever India has seen like a civil strife, these internet shutdowns have become very common. During the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests in Delhi and Uttar Pradesh and other Indian states, the government imposed like a blanket internet shutdown. And there are lots of like reasons for it, definitely. It's mostly because a lot of these movements are youth-led. The anti-CA protest was led by students in India. In Kashmir also, a lot of, you know, like dissident activities carried out by the young people. So this is definitely a tool, you know, like internet shutdown is a tool to clamp down on mobilizing of people, because the internet is a huge part of people's lives. It doesn't just, you know, like apart from, you know, like helping us form relationships, it also like helps us access to, you know, like things that sustain us, like healthcare and food ration and everything. But the government is actively clamping down upon internet so that it restricts mobilization of such movements. And social media is also the space where these kind of thoughts are amplified to a larger audiences. And internet shutdown by itself is supremely unconstitutional. But at the same time, we also don't have, you know, like laws that clarifies what exactly is, you know, like anti-country, anti-national, and like, you know, freedom of speech. We still don't have any clarity on that. A lot of journalists, activists, and other dissidents are arrested and detained because of what they wrote on social media or what they said to a bunch of people in a large gathering. So yeah, there are a lot of these issues that we are witnessing in apparently the world's largest democracy, where anything can be labeled as criticizing the government. It's become a legal issue, it's contested in courts, and, you know, like laws such as the Sedition Act are used to clamp down against like journalists, activists, and dissidents. Another you know, like reason for the internet shutdown is also to control the media narrative. Now, I've been talking to a lot of digital activists and journalists about this, and even during the pandemic, I think like 2 months ago, there was actually a mandate set out for Indian journalists to only report positive news on the pandemic. So there is this clear attempt to, you know, like control the media narrative, and it's not just on journalists, actually, even the healthcare workers like doctors and all, if they have said anything about like not having enough PPEs, they've been threatened, they've been detained, they've been arrested. Some doctors have been beaten up, and there was this recent case where a doctor was put in a mental asylum for reporting, you know, like these inefficiencies in healthcare system. So yeah, internet shutdown has like a lot of reasons, but it's mostly to clamp down on mobilization of people and to control the media narrative. And it has a huge impact. And I don't know, like, I don't know if I should like just mention this, but, you know, like at the same time, while the government imposes internet shutdown, it also uses its material that they caught during surveillance to crack down upon, you know, like activists and dissidents. For instance, during the pandemic, when the whole country is under the lockdown, the government is actually arresting a lot of people who participated in Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests. Which is weird because like they got all the information from their surveillance, like they used facial recognition, they used drones, They are tracking down people on the basis of their information, personal data found on the internet. So it's like, like those two things are happening at the same time. There's an increased surveillance, but at the same time, they're also cutting off people, like with their internet access. But in terms of how people, especially young people, can help out, I actually feel that young people are already like circumventing this, like the new normal of internet shutdowns and surveillance, because they are finding ways to subvert it and, like do their mobilizing thing anyway. In Kashmir, for instance, they started using VPNs. We actually had a bunch of freelance journalists who used to use VPN to send us daily stories, like from Kashmir, about the brutal crackdown, the way people are suffering under the 3-month lockdown that they had. So there are ways that young people are finding to, like subvert these kind of restrictions. But I feel like, as in, after speaking to a lot of advocates, digital activists, and like people who are basically working to help Indians understand what all this surveillance and internet clampdown means, I have come to realize that advocacy has to play a huge role in all of this. We definitely need more digital literacy. But in terms of some action, I feel like a lot of young people need to involve themselves in advocacy and include technology in our constitutional rights. Because at this point, like our authorities are piggybacking on colonial laws, like really outdated laws, in order to crack down upon people. And by including tech in our constitutional rights, our daily freedoms, it's going to really, like not just, like help young people get more informed, but it would also, like help us like from all these internet clampdowns, and actually like empower people to raise their voice against such crazy times. And yeah, I think like instead of just being on the social media, which is great, like a lot of young people are, I feel like, even I feel slightly old, because I see a lot of like people younger than me on social media mobilizing, actually spreading a lot of awareness on social media, but it needs to go a step further. I think this is a point where people need to actively involve themselves in policy making, in advocacy, and yes, absolutely alter the meaning of our constitutional rights and include include technology and internet, because it's a part of our lives. And a lot of young people I know the difference between, like how like the difference between weaponizing technology and actually making use of it. And we just need that. Thank you, Naureen.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pallavi. I think it's a very interesting note to have technology into the constitution, right? I think that's very interesting. And I completely agree that digital literacy is extremely important, especially in Asia, for people to understand on how to work around when there are these sort of shutdowns. And as we've seen, like during the pandemic, people have, through digital means, have gathered these materials and buses for migrants to actually reach back to their places. I think that's a very positive way to look at things, on how citizens and people are gathering momentum to carry out these really positive news during the pandemic. Thank you. I mean, it's great to hear such possible solutions on how we can work and combat these challenges that we face, especially during the pandemic. I think we have like 30 minutes left to our series, and I think we can now open the floor to the audience for a Q&A session, for which I would like to request the audience to identify themselves when either writing their questions on the chat box, or they can just raise their hands, which is there on Zoom, and we can call out their name and they can answer. I mean, they can question themselves. It'd be great if you can also let us know which panelist you would want to ask the question. And once you have raised your hand, then, and your answer and your question has been answered, I would request you to lower your hand as well. We can take about 5 to 6 questions at the moment, and according to the time, we can then see less or more. So I would like to give the floor to the audience if they have any question to ask to our panelists. I can give you like a few seconds to just think about if there's anything that you want to ask.
In terms of fake news, I think it's great that Twitter finally made a move and removed its first tweet of fake news early this week. If you guys know, they actually took down US President Trump's tweet, which included fake news. So yeah, we need more of that. And I think it just showed, I don't know, it showed the power of, like actively, like acting upon such acts of fake news. I really think that they should probably like make these kind of approaches stronger in countries where, like India, where fake news is, like we call it an infodemic. It's probably spreading faster than the pandemic right now over here.
Yeah, you're right. We do have one hand raised. Ariel, if I'm pronouncing it right, please state your question and please let us know which panelist you would like to ask.
Yes. Hi, my name is Ariel. I'm a master's student in human rights and humanitarian action. Thank you both for your intervention. It was really interesting. My question is to both of you. When it comes to fake news and freedom of expression, I think that usually these don't coincide very well, and you've mentioned that. And I was wondering if you felt that the fact that governments have taken more control to deal with this pandemic, do you think this is likely to change once the pandemic is over, or do you think that extended government control could continue as an issue when it comes to dealing with interference with freedom of expression and how we can deal with managing both that and hate speech together? I hope my question was clear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariel, for that. Ms. Usha, would you like to go ahead and answer that? And then Ms. Pallavi can do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you, Ariel, for your question. Firstly, at the outset, it's extremely important to know that freedom of expression, freedom of speech, the right to express yourself, that is very much an intrinsic human right. It is certainly endowed in most of the basic United Nations conventions, and it is very much intrinsic in the way a modern democratic society organizes itself. That is inherent. It's also very much part of customary international law. So that part should not at any stage be curtailed. The freedom to express, the freedom of speech should not be curtailed. What we're actually talking about is fake news, hate speech, racist comments that completely erodes the basic right to the expressive state, which means that you're already bordering from the right to express yourself to actually a breach of human rights. Because xenophobic comments, racist comments, and fake news is actually a breach of human rights. When one goes into that arena of fake news, you're already breaching somebody else's human right or a group human rights. For example, what we had recently in Malaysia, the rights of the Rohingya was seriously eroded by the xenophobic comments, by the fake news that was circulating around that they're in Malaysia because they're economic migrants, they want to get citizenship, they want certain perks and so on. Nothing could be further from the truth. And it led to the fact that the head of the Rohingya group had to go to the police station, actually lodge a report because he feared his life. So that cannot be condoned. That is a breach of human rights in itself. I would go so far to say that fake news is a breach of human rights, and that certainly cannot be condoned. How we're going to balance it, again, is very much the educational aspect. We have to continue educating not just the young. You'd be surprised, the elderly ones as well come up with crazy ideas, you know. And recently, I must state again, on the issue of the Rohingya, it seemed to be a very concerted, organized effort to ensure that they leave our shores. That petition that was put out there on change.org and the Aves website, which garnered 500,000 signatures, that was a very well orchestrated movement done by certain individuals, and it led to a huge momentum of and a torrent of abuse to the Rohingya, and that really eroded their rights. So this is the thing. How do we balance it? Again, for countries that do not ratify certain conventions or do not understand the basic notion of human rights, I wouldn't say Malaysia is so bad. They do understand. However, sometimes, and especially during this pandemic, we saw very clearly the ugly Malaysian coming out, you know, things that were hidden, you know, the dark side, as it were, you know, that really came out very, very clearly. And how do we counter that if there are no laws to counter it? On the one hand, the right of expression is intrinsic. On the other hand, the breach of that right cannot be condoned. And I again urge that every member of society has right has a part to play, you know, to ensure that that posts be taken down, to counter that, and so on. So that's my take on it. Thanks, Naureen.
Thank you, Ms. Usha. Pallavi, would you want to give a brief comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with what Usha said about fake news and misinformation being this absolute breach of human rights. And it's interesting to see that even though there has, and I can speak like for India because I've been noticing this on a daily basis, there are government authorities who are, you know, like imposing these certain laws that aims to restrict, you know, like fake news from disseminating, but at the same time, you know, like since our ideas of freedom of speech and freedom of expression are so vague and ill-defined, that often includes, you know, like as in like this attempt to you know, like stop fake news. It's also included, you know, like people who actually want to speak out about the inadequacies of the situation right now, like the hospitals not having enough PPEs, not having enough infrastructure to like help out people. So I do feel that there is, as Ariel said, that there is this, you know, like certain control that the government is imposing upon people. And by that, I want to point to, you know, like the increased surveillance that has started over the last 2 months. And it's not just, you know, like surveillance in terms of, you know, like keeping a track of people's movements, but there are certain surveillance methods that also keep a track of people's behavior. And eventually it could, you know, like reveal a lot of personal data by, you know, like just like one click of a registration. So, and that's not going to, and like contact tracing is not even, you know, like, you know, like a proven, you know, like measure to contain the virus. It's one of the measures, but the biggest measure still is like, for example, what we've seen in South Korea, apart from aggressive testing, people are also really conscious of the fact that they have to be, you know, like they have to maintain social distancing and all. So people are, you know, like that level of awareness needs to be there more than anything. Like, I think no amount of measures, like from tech and surveillance to, you know, like other clampdowns on people's movements, no amount of surveillance is going to help the virus. It's all about the awareness.
That's true. We have one more question from Soumya Faruqi. She is the project manager for the Central for Africa Justice, Peace and Human Rights in The Hague. Her question is for both the panelists. She asks, are there any attempts being made at policy or government level to engage with social media companies in regards to fake news and hate speech, And how far do you think it will be possible to have a successful engagement of such kinds? Maybe Ms. Pallavi, you can go ahead, and then Ms. Usha can follow.
Yeah, I don't think, especially in India, our policy or government level authorities have done anything to counter fake news or hate speech. In fact, some of our government leaders often make those, like inflammatory speeches against certain marginalized communities. So I think at this point, like a lot of people don't really have faith in government actively doing anything, but there have been conversations with, like platforms like Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter to, like counter fake news. In fact, WhatsApp has recently restricted, like the number of forwards you send to a certain people. Like they've restricted the number of people you can send a particular message to. So that's a good thing. And we actually tested it out, and we actually could not, like send one message to lots of people. But that apparently is still not enough, because there's still fake news out there, which is really impacting a lot of people. And the people who are impacted are the marginalized and vulnerable. So clearly, if they're doing something, it's just not enough.
Thank you, Ms. Pallavi. Ms. Usha, would you want to say if the government is engaging with social media companies in regards to fake news?
Right. Well, in Malaysia, certainly the trend seems to be that if anyone feels threatened by fake news out there on social media, they're advised to immediately lodge a police report, and then the police can do investigation on the matter. Just recently, in brief, we had 2 MPs here that were, it was really out there in social media. They had received death threats, and certain vile comments were made against them, and they went ahead and lodged a police report. And I'm really pleased to say that the police did act on it, and they have brought the culprit of that post to book, and charges will be filed. So that's one way in Malaysia. And the police have always maintained that if you're not happy with a post that goes towards, for example, grievous bodily harm, or it turns fatal in terms of the threat of death, as we've had, the advice is to lodge a police report so that the police can investigate on it. So that's where Malaysia is at the moment. Thanks, Naureen.
Thank you, Ms. Usha. We have a last question. This is the last question that we would take. Is from Mr. Vinay Sharma. This question is to Ms. Pallavi. He asks, Indian mainstream media is mostly focused on sensitizing everything facts are rarely stated, or if they state facts, there is always an agenda behind it. So how do you see this changing, if at all you do, as more than 70% Indians are dependent on mainstream media for information, and they are educated enough on how to fact check, and they're being manipulated because of unbiased news but getting unbiased news should be a fundamental right, and it is being destroyed. So how do you think if this is going to change or not?
I wish I had answers to this, because I'm still busting fake news that my parents tell me almost every day based on the news that they watch on TV. But he's absolutely right. A lot of Indians rely on mainstream media, and right now the mainstream television media especially is peddling a certain narrative that just doesn't go with the ground realities. Like I remember this one time when I think it was in February or something, when the numbers of cases had just started to rise in India. And I remember this one really popular TV channel, and they had invited guests to play some kind of a game which involved them, like singing songs. So that's the level, and which is why I've seen a lot of people, especially in small towns, don't take the pandemic really seriously. And even if they do, they usually blame it on certain communities, which is where the fake news and misinformation plays out, right? So yeah, I honestly feel that a lot of work needs to be done before we see any of this changing. Again, like a lot of our, especially our parents' generations, the boomers and some millennials, and especially like people who are not part of, who don't live in, like cities like Mumbai or Delhi, where they would have exposure to alternate sources of news. A lot of people do buy this kind of narrative, also because it aligns with their own polarized point of views. And everybody right now in India, like a lot of people are very political in terms of, like how they see the world, which is why even a pandemic such as coronavirus, it's more than just a health issue, it's a political issue. So if you criticize what's happening in the hospitals, you're obviously criticizing the government. They don't see any other way. So yeah, I think like the most we can do is, again, like engage with, like players like fact checking companies, and also, like if Twitter, Facebook, these kind of platforms have like the will to do it, it definitely makes sense to involve these guys and engage them in such a way that they do make all these people, all these Indians who are on smartphones, even more so right now, because because apart from like the mainstream news, they're also getting a lot of like fake news from their social media platforms. Like according to the algorithm, like based on the clicks they do, the algorithm shows up one fake news after the other. So digital literacy, again, like I feel that's like one major push that we need. Yeah, that's my only answer. Unfortunately, I'm a little lost in this because I'm it's like something that I also deal with on a daily basis.
No, thank you, Ms. Pallavi, for answering that. I know it's a very tricky question to.
Yeah, and if I may just add, it's really sad because in, for example, smaller towns where people rely on regional news, they're also misreporting a lot of stuff. And I forgot to like add in the previous question, but a lot of like local police had to put out tweets against, like these kind of reports saying that, hey, like this regional newspaper put out claims that Tablighi Jamaat members are attacking hospital staff and spitting on plates and passing it on to people. Guys, this is untrue. This has never happened. So there are some local police officials who are pointing it out, again, using social media to tell people that it's fake news, which is great. So I guess, yeah, we need, like increased engagement with social media users on social media by even like the police forces, because I guess like people do listen to them after a while.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pallavi, for that. We have two more questions. I think I'll take one of them. This is from Milgros Fallus. And this question is, I think, for Ms. Usha. The question is, do you know of other regions or countries in which hate speech has increased in COVID context? And on the other hand, Ms. Usha mentioned educating the public of the issue of hate speech. Could she give some examples that have been effective, especially when people have trouble trusting their government?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Naureen. Yeah. I think I'll take the second part of the question first. Well, as far as countering hate speech, racist comments, xenophobic comments, and so on, there have been some pilot projects done in some of the schools in Malaysia, because, as has been pointed out already, the young use the social media quite a bit. And what happens is, when the young use social media, they need to be able to use it responsibly. They need to be able to understand the information they're receiving, filter the information. They need to know what is fact and what is fiction, because fake news is fiction. It's not fact at all. So when it comes to actually educating the young, which is, I think, part of the question, it should start from school level, college level, and even at universities. We have been actually asking for certain subjects right at primary school, secondary school, and start them young, because social media is here to stay. Every aspect of social media, and everybody is on social media. The kids are teenagers, the young people. So in order for them to be able to use social media responsibly, they have to be educated. Of course, some people have that intrinsic value in them, but still it has to start from school itself. So coming back to the question, there have been some pilot projects in certain schools, and it has been hugely successful. So if it has worked there, it should actually be spread out, and the rest of Malaysia should actually take the road. And not only from secondary, it should be secondary school, primary school, college, university, and upwards. And there's nothing stopping the elderly and the more senior people from actually learning and knowing how to use social media responsibly. So that has to be a continuous process of education as well. What was the first part of the question again? That's the second part. The first part.
The first part was basically, how do you know if other region and countries which has hate speech in other countries also increased in context to COVID?
Well, hate speech seems to be an intrinsic part of every country. I don't think any country, whether it is a developed country or a developing country, is exempt from that. I don't want to name countries over the media like this, but we do know of certain countries where it is extremely rampant. And I do understand that the government is taking steps about it. Within the Asian region, I will go so far as to say that within the ASEAN region, there have been certain aspects of hate speech within the ASEAN, if you know the ASEAN countries. But I will confine my comments to the Malaysian context. The Malaysian aspect of fake news, hate speech, generally translates into xenophobic comments and racist comments, and that we saw greatly increase during the pandemic. So I hope that answered the question, Naureen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Usha. This is the last question that we'll be taking, and this is for Ms. Pallavi. You talked about how we need a lot of fact-checking initiative in different communities. Ms. Vanishka Gupta, she questions, what do you think that the youth can create forums at college level and it can contribute to counter fake news? Also, if these initiatives by students can help, how will these or how should these work? Will these be feasible with a focus on India?
So, like in India, some schools have actually introduced some, I think like by some, I mean like one or two, maybe like from what I have read about introducing fake news as a chapter or a segment as part of the, like academic course, which is, like something that Ms. Usha also spoke about. It plays a huge role because right now fake news and misinformation, it's not just about, like how people are misusing the internet and technology, but it's more about education. Like it all boils down to one very simple fact, that there is no digital literacy. Apart from, like we need people to know how to check what they're seeing on their screens. We need people to know how to verify these things. I mean, these are certain verification tools, is something that, like very few people like us, like for example, journalists, like we go through workshops on how to verify, like fake news, old photos, old videos. And a large chunk of the population in India, especially, like they don't have access to this. They don't know whom to reach out to. They see something and they believe it. It's only because there is no digital literacy, and technology like came suddenly for us. Like for example, like I'm a millennial. Like I grew up at a time where there was no technology, and suddenly there was technology. So I feel like we know how to balance it. Now the Gen Z, like they were born with technology, so they are kind of like taking it forward. But the boomers, like our parents, they don't know what technology is, especially like boomers who are growing up in parts of the country where access to such information is not readily available. There is no awareness. They see what they believe. So I feel that yes, making, like fact checking a part of education is important, not just in college. I feel like you should just include it as part of our school curriculum, because it's become, like I've said, like I think I've been saying it over and over again, it's part of our lives right now, fake news. Like you can't be like nobody is safe from it. It, like, fake news comes to all of us. We encounter it on web browsers. People forward it all the time. We're a part of huge family groups. You basically can't avoid it. So definitely I feel it should be introduced at school levels, like from what I saw in certain schools in India. And if these initiatives by students, how should they work? I feel like, yeah, again, like as I said earlier, education is key right now. Without digital literacy, without knowing what we're facing right now, without acknowledging it, we really can't move ahead. Until then, it'll always be like a battle between like people like select few like us who honestly, like, we live in a bubble. We know what resources to access. But for a lot of people who rely on mainstream media, propaganda, fake news, misinformation, for them that is a reality. Yeah, exactly, that's a reality for them, and nobody can change it unless it's a part of education. So yeah, that's all it boils down to.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pallavi, for answering that question. I think it is very important to have such literacy on digital, especially now when everything is digital. I mean, we're all working from home. It's all digitalized. I think it's very, very crucial for everyone, especially in rural parts of countries. We now end our Q&A sessions. If the participants have other questions, I have just sent a chat with our email ID, which is communications@thecoalitionfortheicc.org. If you'd like to ask any questions after the series, you can mail it to us and we can send it to our panelists and we will let you know. We can mail the answers back to you. As we've just got very little time left to end this session, if Miss Usha and Miss Pallavi, if you can quickly, in like a minute or so, just let us know what would be the main message that you would like our participants, the audience, to take away from today's session. I would request Miss Usha to take the floor first and just give us a very quick takeaway from the session today.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, they just very quickly to answer one part of that earlier question. The country he was asking about, or she was asking about, the country, it's Myanmar, because that's an open book. The fake news, the racist diatribe that was in Myanmar has led to the genocide of the Rohingya people, which is an open book right now. We have 2 cases in the ICC and ICJ. The Rakhine State, they're requesting for an autonomous region that is still within the purview of the United Nations Security Council. So the thrust and the effect of fake news cannot be seen more clearly than what we have in Myanmar, leading to the genocide of the Rohingya people. Having said that, we here, to summarize, we here at the CICC Malaysia, at the Bar Council of Malaysia, the Human Rights Committee, we're doing everything possible to work with our NGOs, to work with our MPs, to work with our fellow lawyers, to work with the think tanks, and to work with our international counterparts to bring awareness, not only about the Rome Statute of the ICC, because there's still so much misconception about it right here within our shores. We need to allay that. Again, another aspect of fake news as well, but also in educating the public about what's right and what's wrong, what is fact and what's fiction. Because, like we rightly said, fake news is a breach of human rights. It is a breach of human rights and it cannot be tolerated. Thank you, Naureen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Usha. Ms. Pallavi, would you like to share your thoughts, especially on the measures and combating challenges during the pandemic?
Absolutely. I absolutely resonated with what Ms. Usha said, and I would just like to add a little bit about, like the role of young people, especially because we are seeing a lot of young people, like there are youth-led movements, social media is full of young people. So yeah, I would definitely reiterate the fact about, like empowering them by, like not just like giving them access to social media, but also like helping them figure out how we can use technology for the betterment of society. And ultimately it's also, like the reason why I keep talking about digital literacy and education is because a lot of people think that, like, oh, fake news is something we watched in the news, oh yeah, it's happening over there. But what they don't realize that it's a part of our lives. Like, people right now think that if they drink some kind of, like if they put some natural herbs in water, they're going to cure the virus. So it's not just about spreading hate, it's also about medical misinformation, which is also quite dangerous. So yeah, so it mostly boils down to all of this, empower the young people. And of course, like, we need to really like alter our laws and regulations, and like get rid of basically these colonial laws and make way for newer laws, so that it empowers this generation and not the generation that we've left behind.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pallavi. And we've come to an end to this session and the series. It is right. I mean, the whole COVID pandemic, especially now, has certainly amplified the spread and use of hate speech globally, largely affecting the vulnerable communities. And as Ms. Pallavi and Ms. Usha effectively said, that it is important for public, media, civil society, and authorities to work together in addressing the root cause of such issues in our society. And it can be done through promoting inclusion and solidarity and empowering, especially the youth. I would like to thank our panelists, Ms. Usha and Ms. Pallavi, for leading this very important discussion and sharing insights on the ongoing challenges and possible solutions to combat hate speech, fake news during these very, very challenging times. I would also like to greatly appreciate all the participants for showing interest and being part of this conversation. I would also want to just let everyone know that the COVID-19 dialogue series will continue to take place for the next few months on important global issues. So please do visit the WFM and the CICC social media pages for the upcoming discussions. And if you have any further questions on today's series, I've already shared the email ID, which is communications@coalitionfortheicc.org. So you can mail it to us, we can send to our panelist. And if there's any topic that you would like us to talk about, then you can also send that and we can definitely look into it. And we shall get back to you as soon as possible. Once again, thank you all for joining us in this conversation. It's definitely been very, very productive. And I wish you all a very good day, and I hope that you stay safe. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining in.